Hello, folks, and welcome to The Farm, a podcast dedicated to synchromysticism, parapolitics, and high weirdness in all its many forms. This is your host, Recluse, aka Stephen Snider, the longtime curator of the Bicep blog and co-author of Strange Tales of the Parapolitical, along with my co-host, Frank Zero. If you like what you hear here today, be sure to check me out at visupview.blogspot.com. That's VISUPVIEW, all one word, .blogspot.com, and procure a copy of the book at the Farm's official store, which is at thefarmpodcast.store. That's the Farm Podcast, all one word, .store. So this week we've got a returning guest who I'm very pleased to have back on here for a third time. I'm, of course, referring to the great Paul Weston. Paul is the author of such works as Mysterium Maturius, Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus, Avalonian Aeon, the Michael Line, the Kabbalah and the Terror, William Blake and the Glastonbury Gnosis, the Occult Battle of Britain, and most recently, History and Myth, Boris Johnson, Henry VIII, Extinction Rebellion, Plague, and the Return of the Middle Ages. He also published and contributed to the anthology Signs and Secrets of the Glastonbury Zodiac. Having majored in comparative religion for a combined arts degree, Paul went on to work for the Scientology-influenced Institute of Hypnosis and Parapsychology. He eventually became completely absorbed into the Glastonbury Matrix and was fortunate to be closely involved in the psyche-questing work of Andrew Collins, a Glastonbury tour guide and frequent lecturer whose presentations are increasingly uploaded onto YouTube. His other main influences and inspirations include such figures as Colin Wilson, Dion Fortune, Riki, Mother Maria, Gurdjieff, Anthony Robbins, and of course, UFOlogy. Paul, thank you so much for joining us again here today.
Thanks for that. I feel it's going to be an interesting little chat tonight.
I certainly hope so. Now, today we are going to be talking about Paul's brilliant Aleister Crowley and the Aeon of Horus work. Not only is it an outstanding account of Crowley's lasting importance, but it's also a fabulous chronicle of the esoteric and occult developments throughout the 20th century, and all in the mold of the great Robert Anton Wilson. I mean, we certainly love Raw around these parts. So today we're going to use Crowley and the Aeon of Horus as a launching pad for a broader discussion. It centers around the darker side of UFOlogy and some of the more unsettling developments of late. So let's dig right in. All right, now there has been this kind of shadow side to modern UFOlogy that I just alluded to from practically the very beginning. And one of the figures that towers head and shoulders above the others in this netherworld is William Dudley Pelley. You did such a great job of covering Pelley and the Aeon of Horus, and I was hoping if you could just give us a rundown here to start off with, Paul.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, first of all, the reason that I covered him was because I was doing a general overview of people that had had extraordinary episodes where they'd gone into altered states of consciousness, had contact of some kind with some intelligence that they believed to be external to themselves, and it set them off on some kind of mystical odyssey. So, Crowley with the Book of the Law is the prime example. I was looking at other people who went into the zone, and what they then manifested could be seen as part of the weird flavour of Crowley's unfolding eon, of which UFOlogy is certainly part. Now, the thing about William Dudley Pelley that absolutely fascinated me was that he seems to be an extraordinarily American oddity, a genuine American oddity. A person in this day and age that we think was worthy of a Netflix series, but looking back at the way that Strange Angel was handled, they get the period detail absolutely spot on, but I don't think there's a script writer on the planet that could do justice to this story. And the thing that made me, really eager to talk tonight was, although I wrote all this stuff over 10 years ago, it now seems, with the climate being what it is, that Pelley seems strangely modern and contemporary again, and there's a continuity which I'll go into that I think's very disturbing. So to go into his broad biography, firstly, he was a newspaper correspondent who had been in Russia during the time of the revolution, And there's no question that this was one of the real formative influences, because he sees a whole bunch of horrors out there which turns him into a vehement anti-communist from day one. And he also has a fateful association in his mind, set in motion, that becomes, set in concrete in the end, that communism equals Jews. And that's not exactly an uncommon idea at the time, but it's kind of where you go with it that's important. So back in America in the early 20s, he's writing some novels, modestly successful, even did a few screenplays for some minor Hollywood movies of the silent era. But this anti-Semitism that is growing drives him away from an industry that he just feels is completely dominated by Jews, and he can't be dealing with that. So it's at this point in the 1920s that he has a mysterious illumination destiny episode. He has some kind of out-of-the-body experience, and he describes it in a short pamphlet in 1928 as My 7 Minutes in Eternity. And in this ecstatic interlude, as he calls it, he comes into the presence of beings of some kind, beings of light. And from that point on, his whole consciousness is permanently mutated. And it's only a few days later, he's on a night train journey. And he's just reading a book. And then suddenly, in the midst of pretty much turning a page, white light completely and utterly fills him. Everything disappears, and he says that a great flood of revelation came to me, out of which a voice spoke such as I had never heard before. What it said I prefer to keep permanently to myself, but in that instant I knew that his previous experience a few days earlier had not been a dream or even a self-hallucination. Particularly, I knew of the reality of that entity whom the world now designates as Jesus of Nazareth. I knew that he was not a mythical religious ideal. I knew his ministry and career had been a literal actuality, and that I'd once seen him when he was thus in his flesh. So he comes out of this experience on a higher emotional buzz, and he's got this kind of divine mission that he's going to promote this weird millennial Christianity that is infused with a mix of theosophical style ideas, and above all is rabidly racist. And shortly after this, he starts producing automatic writing from a being who wants to be thought of as an elder brother. And when you read, examples of this early stuff, you think, well, this is fine, there's no problem here. There must be neither tears nor shadows of tears in the way of the Spirit. All is light, all is joy, all is beauty to those whose eyes have been opened to the radiance. Why should joy bring even the fleeting semblance of that which ye call pain? So that's just a fragment of a long message, and volumes of this follow in the manner of the channeled material of later decades. And he starts hearing stuff, it becomes clairaudient. And the contrast of these sentiments, which seem mighty fine, with his racism and where all this goes, is a measure, we could say, of the enigma of the man. Now, all of this is happening just prior to the Wall Street crash of 1929. And Pelley blames this on Jewish bankers, and he starts to pay increasing attention to the career of Hitler. And when the Nazis came to power in January 1933, he's immediately inspired to found a group that he calls the Silver Shirts. And when you read about them, they get generally labelled as fascists, but in all truth, you might just as well call them Nazis. They were Nazis. They paraded around in uniforms. They promoted virulent anti-Semitism. And whilst the esoteric roots of the German Nazis were kind of kept in the background, Pelley's got no qualms about promoting a blend of politics and a weird mix of channeled messages with theosophical and millenarian Christian tone. And in 1936, he actually runs for president as a so-called Christian Party candidate. And he got called in the press of the time the Star-Spangled Fascist. And this is the kind of Christianity that wants segregated Jewish ghettos in America, along with the same kind of legislation that had just been passed in Germany, you know, the Nuremberg laws, barring them from all public life. Now, he didn't get exactly that many votes, and the membership of the Silver Shirts maxes out at around 15,000, which might not seem too many, but it's still 15,000 too many, really. And, you know, the whole situation in Europe deteriorates, but Pelley continues to support Hitler. In fact, he's still supporting Hitler at the point where America and Germany go to war, and did not want German involvement. And in fact, remarks that he made against the government led to him going on trial, and he was actually put in jail for the rest of the war. He spent years in jail, and he was let out eventually after the war on the understanding that he should avoid public life and just shut up about any of these kind of opinions that he'd been expressing. But he didn't really abide by that. Almost immediately, he stated that the newly created United Nations organisation was all part of a Jewish communist conspiracy. Now, this is also, of course, the time when the UFO era gets going. And within a few years, Pelley has become a contactee, to put alongside a whole bunch of other extremely strange characters. And in 1950, he gets a book out called Star Guests. So he's one of the very first in print, and he helps set a kind of template for what's coming. And he also creates a group called Soulcraft, which is as a vehicle for a whole bunch of UFO material, which soon becomes absolutely gigantic. And he claimed to have actually seen a UFO in 1953. So we've got a cosmology here that is kind of stated. The human race started 30 to 50 million years ago when star guests mated with primates. And the different races of our planet were seeded by different aliens. So the white master race come from Sirius, and in a model that's reminiscent of Blavatsky's root races, the Jews are some kind of unfortunate troublemaking hybrid, and so on. And we're all involved in an enormous reincarnational process that includes long periods between human lives spent in other planes being purified. And a hard core of individuals come together as mentors for humanity during crucial times. And these are the 144,000 mentioned in the Book of Revelation. And he kind of sticks to a millennial Christian centre of gravity and always considered he was living in the end times. And he was into pyramidology, you know, the belief that the dimensions of the Great Pyramid and its interior design can be interpreted prophetically. And he even believed that Hitler's coming to power in 1933 was prophesied in the Great Pyramid through this means. And he comes out, and this is interesting, this is where it gets a bit spooky, he comes up with a prediction for the second coming of Christ. And he says it's going to happen on the 17th of September 2001. So, you know, it's safe to say there was a little bit of apocalypse in the air around about then. He actually believed that he was in contact with Nostradamus, who was dictating material, fresh material, directly to Pelley, and a whole bunch of other historical characters came along for a little chit chat. And one of the things that's really, really fascinating about this UFO material is you can obviously dismiss him as a distinctly unpleasant person with perverse ideas. But one of the things he says in the 50s, echoing Meade Lane and the ether ships, is the idea that the UFOs are not built of fabricated materials like our earthly airplanes. You know, they're thought form creations, as he puts it, from higher octaves of reality, made seemingly solid by lowering the vibratory rates of the substance of their construction. So there's something very intriguing in that. So we can obviously say that he's a twisted and ultimately ineffectual figure in his politics, but there's this legacy, you see, that he's left behind him, this blend of anti-Semitism, and in the Silver Shirts, there was an encouragement to cultivate military and survivalist skills. and a last days, millennial Christianity, that kind of vibe. And this becomes one of the templates for the extreme right. In fact, there was a guy called Richard Butler, who was an important figure in the Aryan Nation group, who had been in the Silver Shirts, and he kind of became an elder figure. He carried this whole thing right through into his old age. So you've got, a figure such as this right in the early days of ufology, and George Hunt Williamson became a Soulcraft employee in 1953 and wrote a UFO type column in one of Pelley's publications for over a year. So with this cast of characters established, with George, I hand over to you.
All right. Yeah. I mean, that was great, Paul. I mean, it's just fabulous to hear your account of Pelley and all the stuff that he got into. So, but one of the things with Pelley that really stands out to me is his strange connections with the Sirius tradition. I mean, he had brought this up, I believe, as far back as the late 1920s or something to that effect. And it's really, an interesting topic. Essentially, this sort of occultic perspective of it really goes back to the famous Theosophist Alice Bailey, of course, the one who's gained quite a bit of notoriety in conspiracy circles around or over the years. Certainly, she's got the whole Lucius Trust thing and that type of thing. But she really was not widely read during her time in the early 20th century, and probably the only people who have really read her recently are the Alex Jones types of the world, and probably not even them. However, one of the people who does seem like they read her and really bought into what she was selling was Pelley. So, that kind of brings up an interesting line of progression, essentially, with this Theosophical influence on his ideology.
Well, okay, yeah. With Alice Bailey, it should be said that she breaks with Theosophy. She becomes a thing unto herself. And in terms of how many people are aware of her material, an awful lot of New Agers. The so-called Great Invocation has been recited at the moment of the full moon by a guy in Glastonbury in a particular public space every single full moon for I think it's over 40 years. There's an awful lot of Alice Bailey influence in the New Age. But you're right that there are enormous aspects of Bailey's work which are extremely dubious. And when it came to the atomic era and what that meant, the so-called externalization of the hierarchy, there is a whole bunch of stuff in her work that can be clearly seen to have an air of anti-Semitism about it. Any piece of work at all that uses the term the Jewish problem immediately identifies itself as a problem. However much we're looking through a filter from decades later. I think it's a case of where people's minds get to. That some of these things are kind of very broadly neutral, but if the rest of your head is in distortion mode, then you will warp it out when you start to connect with it and start thinking about it and expressing it in your own way.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, it does kind of seem like the Pelley did give her a bit of a platform because, My 7 Minutes in Eternity, it was very widely read in the late 1920s. I believe it had sold something like 6 or 7 million copies, which, I mean, that doesn't seem quite significant now, but I believe at the time the United States only had a population of about 65 million. So that was a pretty considerable amount of the public. He did have a bit of a platform before he went full Nazi, essentially, in the early 30s. So, yeah, I mean, do you kind of think that he was really the one who had helped spread some of this serious ideology that was, of course, later taken up by his protege, George Hunt Williamson?
I'm not aware of anybody who focuses on it in quite that way at that period of time. I mean, the stuff is there in the background, but he's the guy who kind of puts it out into the realm of public mystical discourse rather than stuff that's bubbling away in secret.
Okay. Well, then let us move on to his protege, George Hunt Williamson, who is an equally fascinating character in his own right. As you had alluded to, they had kind of hooked up around 1953, but by that point in time, Williamson had already made a name for himself in the UFO circuit. He was something of a mystic by that time as well. Can you just give us a little bit of his his resume a little bit before he hooked up with Paley?
Well, I was assuming you were going to go over George, as you seem to have quite a bit of interest in him. I mean, obviously, I think one of the most intriguing things is that he's hanging with Adamski,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he's actually present on the fateful car ride out into the desert where something is suddenly seen coming to land out of the sky, and Adamski just says, "Well, hang on, I'm going to just go check this out. Stay here," and the rest is literally history.
Yeah. And I mean,
But
that was,
obviously his mystical input is ginormous, even greater so than Pele, and he's chewed up a whole bunch of theosophical stuff, and he's developed these weird ass means. I think he worked out he tinkered around with some radio transmitter and worked out some way of trying to contact the Space Brothers around about this period of time, and then goes on, and I think this is partly Pelly's influence. He's come into contact with somebody that has developed an enormous cosmological, mystical history of the human race that is a mix of ufology and theosophical style mysticism with reincarnation, and he goes on, to produce the lights of the secret places of the lion and road in the sky, which take it to a whole new level of the game from Pele, because his kind of presentation of the theosophical style material and the way in which he sets up chains of reincarnational figures, mystery schools and so forth. That's really, really fascinating. But there in the background is this kind of lingering stuff about international bankers, the Jews, etc., etc.
yeah, definitely. There's some strange stuff with that. I mean, a few points. Williamson, of course, had apparently developed mystical inclinations going back to when he was a teenager. So, I mean, this, I believe it roughly occurred right around the onset of the UFO era, maybe even slightly before. And then also, of course, with the Adaminsky encounter, a big thing about that, too, is this was really the first time we saw an appearance of those, what have subsequently become kind of infamous, those blonde-haired, blue-eyed, large Venetian space brothers that have become rather ominous.
It does seem like they might have stepped out of some Nazi fantasy.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely there is an element of that, and just in general, Williamson's whole approach, which really incorporated a lot of these, metaphysical and occult interpretations of the UFO phenomena, was very, very novel, especially for this era. I mean, we're talking about the early 1950s. It really would be nearly 20 years before this kind of stuff became really in vogue in the field with the writings of people like John Keel and Jacques Vallée and so forth. And then, of course, his whole presence in Arizona, which had attracted a lot of strange figures in these early, metaphysical fields around this time as well. So, certainly there's a lot of interest in him. And then also, as you kind of alluded to, those funny names and the shortwave radio transmissions, of course. With the radio communications, I mean, this is something that they had alluded to in Hellier, but I mean, this sort of, laid the foundation in a sense for later alleged communications with paranormal entities, with these, spirit boxes and things like that. I mean, this is a concept that Williamson was toying with back in the early to mid 1950s. And also the ancient astronaut trope as well. That was another thing that he rolled out, I believe, around 1954 or something like that. So, I mean, a lot of this stuff that we tend to associate is really emerging with the 1960s counterculture in regards to UFOs. Williamson and by default Pele were the trailblazers in a very real sense of this kind of stuff.
To further give some perspective and context on that, okay, Adamski, the famous book Flying Saucers of Landed that is co-authored with Desmond Leslie. Desmond Leslie on our side of the pond, he's a guy that in many respects gets the ancient astronauts trope out there. That book has got, which is early 50s, 52, I think, has got a tremendous amount of that kind of material. So that's kind of in the airwaves. It's definitely there with Desmond Leslie. He's a fascinating character in his own right. But what he got with Williamson is something very, very distinct that from our interest now, it kind of follows through. It seeds into the new age. It seeds into the new age of the 80s and the present day. And the thing that's always distressing is that new ages seem to be strangely lacking in any kind of historical perspective of where their ideas have come from and how much of what they're coming out with has already been done before by other people, and the fact that sometimes built into this stuff are problematical areas which need to be seen for what they are and faced one way or another. Yeah, I mean, I really, really like Williamson. I think he's an amazing character. And the later reclusive monastery of the Seven Rays phase, where he kind of disappears into South America and so on, all of that kind of stuff is remarkable. But there is just this weird-ass stuff that follows through and is there just everywhere, whether it's David Icke or wherever it is, that people from a certain amount of basic broad information, okay, there are a lot of Jewish people in the international banking system, all right, there are a lot of Jewish people in Hollywood, but to then project an entire, philosophy and cosmology of global conspiracy and manipulation from, some incredible metaphysical evil outwards from that is another thing altogether, and leads you into all sorts of flipping trouble, as per Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So you did a great job of, giving an overview of Williamson and the Crowley book. But since you've written that, though, there has been a lot of new information that's come out about him. And certainly they've added a host of different perspectives to some of the things that he was up to. So one of the stranger things that's come out essentially was his connection to the curious saga of the Nine, alleged extraterrestrial interdimensional beings that various groups have received channeled communications from since the early 1950s. Now, the major figure behind this mythos was an artichoke scientist called Andrija Puharich, who was also a pioneer in the CIA Pentagon ESP experiments as well. In recent years, some compelling evidence has emerged that it was actually Williamson who was the medium who delivered a message to Puharich and Arthur Young, a wealthy inventor and fellow New Age guru who was tied into all of this in Mexico when they were there. I think they might have actually been searching for magic mushrooms at the time. And they were approached by a couple called the Logheads, I believe, Logheads, something to that effect. And they themselves had been UFO contactees. Of course, they were the subject of the infamous book When Prophecy Fails. Shortly after that whole, attempt at a UFO cult there had fallen through, they had hooked up with George Hunt Williamson, and they brought a message from Williamson to Young and Puharich, which had allegedly been channeled by the Nine. So, I mean, what's your take on Williamson appearing in all this saga? I mean, the Nine is one of the kind of holy of holies.
I've been fascinated by the whole Nine thing for a long time. I'm friends with Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, so I remember, when they put out the Stargate conspiracy, and I was aware of the material that was going into it, and I paid a lot of attention to it at the time. And as I mentioned to you in a message the other week, some of the material from Phyllis Schlemmer eventually that was channeled as from the Nine, that was gathered together as a book that had an awful lot of circulation amongst New Agers in the 90s, called The Only Planet of Choice. That was actually put together by somebody called Paulden Jenkins in Glastonbury. At one point, I lived virtually just over the road from the place where that had all been put together. So I've always been absolutely fascinated by that entire story. The idea that Williamson is now a player in that just makes it was complex enough to be going on with anyway. But it's just really is enough to do your head in. And in terms of, again, one has the sense that there is some, I'm willing to entertain the idea that there are external intelligences involved, but of course it's a case of like, can we trust them? Do they mean well by us? And, is there war in heaven? And what different factions are being manipulated by them to what end? I mean, when the Stargate conspiracy came out in '99, there was a sense that the whole alternative Egyptology scene of the time, the whole Nine business, there was a kind of attempt to maneuver and manipulate things and to create an ET type cultist New Age religion out of that scene at the time. It obviously didn't work out that way. The whole thing on New Year's Eve 1999 at the Great Pyramid did not go according to the original ideas of how it was supposed to, and something didn't quite pan out there. But there was a sense of a sort of manipulation in there, and this just again leads you back to the mysteries of what the hell was really going on in the 50s. We know Adamski's a very dubious character. We know that the intelligence groups are all over the place. It's inevitable, of course they would be, and that there are people manipulating and so forth. But the bottom line for me has always been that there are genuinely unusual people having genuinely unusual extreme experiences where they are unquestionably contacted by some mysterious something, and that it is trying to have an effect on the collective mind, to be a carrier wave of something or another in the way that Shat Valley would later have it. But it is because of those difficult aspects, this whole thing with the paranoid conspiracy about the Jews and the war in heaven and all this kind of stuff. Is this simply a symptom of human cultural stupidity? Or is there some warped out, other thing altogether from beyond that is messing with us? This is the big question that I haven't got an answer to.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, in the Stargate conspiracy, there had been some concern expressed by the authors of some hints of anti-Semitism and some of the other channeled messages from the Nine. Am I remembering that correctly?
I think there's a hint of that kind of thing all the way through a lot of this. On the other hand, let's not forget that Puharich's most famous moment is his interaction with Uri Geller, and yes. And the whole wild and wacky story of how they prevent the Yom Kippur War, and that whole period of time from going down far worse. And that they perhaps ultimately save Israel and the world from things that are far worse. But of course, the Purich story is perhaps the wildest and wackiest of all stories that we've got that came out of the high weirdness 70s.
Yeah, no, that had never actually occurred to me, but yeah, you essentially had one of the Chandlers who was Israeli stage musician / spy, and the other one kind of linked up with these white supremacists, anti-Semite types. Yes, no, Williamson was certainly a character, if nothing else. So anyway, though, but he essentially dropped out of the UFO field in 1961, and this certainly adds to his character. There's been a lot of speculation over the years as to the reasons for that. Well, in a recent work by two Italian researchers, it's an excellent book called The Incredible Life of George Hunt Williamson, they argued that this was because Williamson was convinced that he was the heir to the throne of Serbia. Okay, apparently his mother had told him this when her health had begun to decline around 1959, and allegedly he spent the rest of his life pursuing this claim. He is even alleged to have been in negotiations with Tito, the longtime dictator of Yugoslavia, for years over this claim. So, I mean, Paul, I got to ask you, what's your take on this curious incident?
Well, that is obviously a major curveball. It's like something that you simply... before this kind of stuff came to light, if any speculation that you ever could have had about what's the deal with Williamson, you quite simply, there would have been nothing that could have pointed you in the direction that was what was going down. Why that is, because we know that he's got this profound thing about reincarnational identities, that different people reincarnate down through the ages. How he places himself in all of that, bearing in mind the whole thing about Serbia and the fact that the date of the battle that is the strongest thing in Serbian mythology is the same date that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was very foolishly given to turn up in Sarajevo, thus making it absolutely inevitable that Serbian nationalists would get the hump about it and try and take him out, which they indeed did. And that then leads to, a massive, great global catastrophe. And then decades later, as we're coming up to the millennium, you have the whole scene go down in the Balkans again, and you've just got a totally weird karma playing out there that's inscrutable. Williamson must have had profound and utterly strange thoughts on all this, and it would be great to somehow figure out what on earth he thought he was doing. If he had actually found himself set up as King of Serbia, what the hell would he have done?
Certainly a good question. All right. So it's also come out that Williamson was a wandering bishop. I suppose in light of his pretext of noble blood, that's not entirely surprising because there are a lot of Fox nobles in wandering bishop circles. And like all good wandering bishops, he eventually started his own church. Now, I've been trying to track down his line of consecrations, but no luck on that end. But just placing him in these circles is utterly fascinating. Do you have any thoughts on this particular aspect of it, Paul?
What always interests me about the wandering bishops, because Shaktipat blessings is one of the things that I find most fascinating, when there are people that have somehow been empowered to simply, they touch you on the head, they give you the nod, and the power of the lineage or whatever it is, literally passes as the Holy Spirit from them into you. And if it really works out, you may have a serious weird one in the process. I wonder, I'd like to hear first-hand accounts of people coming into contact with Williamson when he's in wandering bishop mode. What the hell did he do? What was it literally that he was wandering about with? It's some kind of strange blessing, if you like, some kind of connection to that is supposed to go right back to the early days of the church and Pentecost and coming down of tongues of fire and so forth. This does make him like some kind of weird medieval figure, as if we haven't got enough to be going on with anyway.
Yeah, no, he was definitely a strange one to begin with, but the whole wandering bishop thing just adds another level to that. So, now kind of firmly establishing Williamson as a true historical curiosity, and a little bit about the tremendous influence he's had on just the whole UFO scene for decades now. Let's go into a broader rundown on how this affects things in this day and age, okay? So one thing that's been on my mind of late is Williamson's possible role in Alan Greenfield's so-called secret ciphers of the UFOnauts. It's gotten a lot of attention lately due to Hellier. Greenfield clearly cited a cipher system in Royal Arch Freemasonry as a precursor. One of Williams' associates appears to have been using a system based on the Royal Arch cipher that had been very similar to the one Greenfield ultimately adopted, as you had pointed out in Aeon. And what's more, Williamson contributed a lot of these so-called funny names the Greenfield cipher system feeds off of. So it's also interesting that Williamson and Greenfield are both wandering bishops as well. So, I mean, again, I got to get your take on all this. It's a very, strange series of events.
Well, this is where, if I was just going to wildly free associate, I would go back to the days of the Gnostics, and I would go into a sense of Philip K. Dick and the plasmate and so forth. Obviously with a figure like Dick and everything we know about him in the 70s, it's clear that this combination of a mystical Christianity that goes back to the Gnostics, and contact with non-human intelligences in a very kind of sci-fi context as a mysterious unity that is alive and kicking and potent. That was up. We've seen that demonstrated. That's up and running. I would say that with the Secret Cipher and with the example of people like Williamson and the weird vibe and the mix that they're carrying, that it's something like that. One of the very, very best Secret Sun posts that Chris ever did was when he took a Mithraic liturgy from the early centuries AD and interpreted it with ufological imagery and made it clear just how well that fitted. That, when the experiencer of the gnosis in the middle of this ritual, rises up out of their body and sees all these various things going on, it's extraordinarily familiar to us from the templates that have come forth in the 1950s. So I get that feeling. I get that feeling that the plasmate stirred. My own take on it. Philip K. Dick says 1974. I've said in Aeon of Horus that Nag Hammadi, came out of the ground, was discovered, the same month that L. Ron Hubbard turned up at the parsonage, and him and Jack started brainstorming the Babylon working. I figure the Nag Hammadi plasmate hit California a lot earlier than 1974. So we can put, the likes of Williamson as a possible on that, because there is just this profound reincarnational thing going on, a sense of mystery schools, a sense of transmission, and with what you've said about the wandering bishops and so forth, that all hangs together for me. That works for me.
Yeah, it is certainly a fascinating topic with that, and something I'm going to be exploring in a forthcoming work. It is quite a story. But for now, with Hellier top gold here for a little bit, let's get back to those blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan spacemen who are starting to become so much more prevalent once again. Williamson was there with Adaminsky for the first encounter with such a space brother who was dubbed Orthon. But that particular archetype has been with us for a while now. What's more unsettling is you're starting to see it embraced by the QAnon movement. Of course, QAnon is in of itself showing all the hallmarks of a cult in its own right. Is this something that we should be worried about, especially with the return of Williamson to a broader audience with all this stuff going on?
Well, I think, yes, absolutely. QAnon, I've tried to not go down the rabbit hole with it, but you can't avoid it. And for example, here in Glastonbury, a lot of the New Agers here are giving over to it in its entirety, because there is what you might call an extreme New Age form of it at the very, very far end of the spectrum, where, Trump is in with the Pleiadian light beings and the Arcturians and ushering in, once the Dark Cabal have been defeated and thrown into the lake of fire, we're going to have free energy. We're going, the whole thing is all going to open up, and angels in the forms of ET will be with us, and it'll be, a Spanglified New Jerusalem, and Papa Dom will have proved to be, the king of the last days, who will usher in the time of the righteous. And that is one hell of a mix, man. And there's an awful lot of things in there in terms of the fact that you're getting a bunch of stuff that seems like channel material from the New Age 80s in California is just kind of being rehashed in a modern context. But the deeper roots of it, to me, is Book of Revelations, medieval millennialism, kind of stuff I've actually written about in history and myth, the kind of stuff that really got going round about the time that Joachim of Fiore had prophesied that there were three ages of the human race. There was an age of the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and he'd worked out from the Bible that the age of the Holy Spirit was going to kick in about 1260. And his work generated a whole bunch of pseudo-Joachite prophecies, where the Book of Revelation kind of timescale got a bit warped out, a few things got messed around with. But basically, you had a situation where any powerful ruler that cropped up, and the first one was Frederick Barbarossa, was taken to be somebody that was going to be the emperor of the last days, that the end times were near, and a whole series of things were going to go down where there'd be a confrontation with the forces of Satan. You know, the bad guys would be chucked into the lake of fire, and then the millennium, which is 1,000 years, where basically the righteous set up their New Jerusalem on earth before the heavenly New Jerusalem and the second coming of Christ come down. That was anticipated over and over and over and over and over again throughout the Middle Ages. Any king, any ruler, who the moment they came to the throne, they were kind of scanned for, is this going to be the person? Are they going to do it? And all kind of hopes depend on them. You get all kinds of weird uprisings, people setting up their communities, their little New Jerusalems. It always ends in tears. But this kind of thing has followed through. You know, it's there very much in the American DNA, you know, where, as Robert Anton Wilson, you know, used to say, it's like with California, it's the heretics of the heretics. You know, people left the old world, people left Britain because they were persecuted for their weird religious beliefs. And then they got to the States, and then they just carry on going. And you end up with all manner of weird-ass religious groups, some of which, you know, more resemble, you know, the Preacher Cain in Poltergeist 2. It all gets a bit goddamn weird. And you end up with things that range from Waco to free love cults. But somewhere in the background of all this is the sense that the way the QAnon mythos is being played so that it hits the Bible Belt crazies as well as the more New Agey Christians is that Trump is a kind of, you know, righteous king of the last days, and that in draining the swamp, you know, he's getting the bad guys out of the way and chucking them into the lake of fire. Now, the thing that's obviously gives it a lot of leverage is that, you know, we've got some bad guys. You know, Ghislaine Maxwell has just been arrested, Epstein, the whole scene. It is grotesque. These people are villains, but the extreme forms of the mole children, you know, down in the multitudinous tunnels beneath the ground, being harvested for their adrenochrome and horribly murdered by Hillary Clinton in convenient videos, you know, all this sort of stuff is just a wild escalation. And, you know, the interpretation that, you know, you have an earthquake, a few earthquakes in the US, apparently it's, you know, underground warfare going on. You know, there's stuff going down in tunnels where the white hats and the black hats of the dark cabal are fighting it out. And, you know, Trump is kind of cool to all this. This is absolutely very, very dangerous. Because to me, always, and I've said this on a few occasions in a few podcasts now, from day one, what was absolutely clear to me was that what's really going on here is that we are being encouraged to basically stand up and applaud and holler enthusiastically when an enormous, great swathe of people, an entire political class, are swept off the street, arrested, and thrown into what are essentially concentration camps without trial, Guantanamo Bay and so on. You know, we've been hearing that the Obamas, the Clintons, they've already been arrested, they're tagged, they're in Guantanamo Bay. You know, it's CGI effects, it's clones, it's doubles, it's what you're seeing now on the TV, that it's all a done deal. And the horrors of the cabal that's going to be exposed for the fact that all these kids are sort of under the ground having their adrenochrome harvested, and presumably, you know, somewhere along the line in some of these accounts, you've got malevolent ETs, you've got demons, you've got the whole thing. That basically we should be perfectly happy if all the people that are the perpetrators of this are essentially killed. And this is like a fire stuff. It is. Now, you know, that's not to say, of course, Epstein, Maxwell, everybody that's had any connection with them in the perpetration of this, they are flipping evil. But it's more grotty, more down to earth than this elaborate mythology. You know, it's just a whole bunch of wretched shit. And when you put all of this on it, you send people crazy, and you basically put them into a mindset where absolutely everybody of a particular type is all guilty. And the fact that they conveniently are the critics of your own worldview, your own regime and your own way of doing things doesn't matter. So that is profoundly dangerous and profoundly weird. And this is why it seems that somebody like Pelley now has this contemporary vibe about him. That he seems to be somebody that could be walking the American political landscape right now, as all these extremist groups, the Boogaloo Boys and so on, are all kind of welcoming a last day scenario, and I think we're being, in some ways, it's manipulated into that. I don't want to. I try not to allow myself to give over too many hours to thinking about this, because everybody is pretty much going crazy at the moment. But it's difficult to avoid the sense that there is a profound manipulation and psyop going on, and it's manipulating our emotional, mythological consciousness through all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely agree. And I mean, I do think that's very pertinent to point out how our mythology is really being weaponized against us. And I mean, just speaking here in the States, I mean, to me, just the really disturbing trend that I've noticed in recent months is just how open so many people from different sides of the political spectrum would be to a military dictatorship at this point. I mean, as you've kind of alluded to, you've got these kind of far right QAnon types who, think that if we were to declare martial law and essentially turn things over to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, we would get the pedophiles all rounded up and what have you. But on the flip side of the coin, a lot of liberals would welcome a military coup at this point as well to remove Trump. So, this is very unsettling to me. I mean, you never, ever, ever want to, support a military coup d'etat. It's a horrible precedent. And sadly, it really seems like it's gaining momentum here. But there's one last thing I wanted to ask you here right quick before we wrap up. So I know you've alluded to QAnon in the Middle Ages a lot, and this is really the subject of your most recent work as well. I know specifically you really went into the Extinction Rebellion and its parallels to the Children's Crusade and so forth. Do you kind of see this sort of emerging zeitgeist of kind of a neo-feudalism or something that's, kind of subtly becoming a meme for all of us now?
The center of gravity of it all is this millennialism, and the thing that I identified in History and Myth, which is a fascinating thing to me, and I learned it from the historian Norman Cohn in his book The Pursuit of the Millennium, is that there are profoundly strange symmetries between these Christian ideas and the Marxist worldview. And there are also a certain amount of things that pan out in Nazism as well. But basically, what you had in the pre-Christian classical world, you had a kind of golden age mythology, that there have been these different ages, the age of gold and silver and iron and bronze and so forth. And in the golden age, everybody had all their goods in common. Nobody worked, everybody just shared their food and so on. And you've also got, in the Bible, you've got a whole thing at the time of the early church in the Acts of the Apostles. It said how everybody shared their stuff in common. And what you find going through the Middle Ages, the stuff from the Bible and the stuff also from the classical age mythology, which doesn't go away, blends together in a kind of social class war thing. And that when there are economic upheavals and when the poor are really oppressed, so what basically they want to do is get back to how it was in the golden age purity time. And so, what you get when Marx comes along and creates this kind of schemata of history is something that really, really strangely corresponds to what is already there with Christianity, although Marxism is supposed to be secular. So the Garden of Eden is like what they call primitive communism, that originally, everybody does have all their stuff in common and there's no private ownership and stuff. And then the fall, if you like, the booting out of Eden is the development of private property in the class system. And then the last days, there's a final flourish of capitalism and imperialism. And instead of when the saints go marching in, it's when the proletariat go marching in. They're the chosen people. And the second coming is like this socialist communist revolution, where ultimately the state itself somehow abolishes itself. Now, we know this has never happened, and we know there's a pretty damned high body count whenever anybody attempts to do it. But what it basically means is that you can't get away from certain aspects of this thing. You think that, you know, in a communist worldview, which is supposed to be hostile to religion and hostile to Christianity, you've literally still got the same thing playing out. So you've got the same thing coming from two different sides of the spectrum. And I'm not going to talk about Extinction Rebellion too much. I would say that I don't really mention the Children's Crusade, although I could have done. The broad thing is all played out there in relation to upheavals of people trying to set up a new Jerusalem, where the 1% and where the people that are abusing the planet and the system, you know, again, they get ultimately, they're conceived of as the people that maybe need to go into the lake of fire, and that will go back, you know, to the golden age, will go back to the Garden of Eden, or will go back to the early days of the church. But the whole structure of our society has to be dismantled in doing that. And I simply point out that there have been so many times when people think, you know, this is it and it's time to do this. It's never worked out ever. Not ever, not once. Every single time this thing goes down, it's just a pile of corpses and cultural catastrophe and ruin. And this is why I'm a history freak. It does get very vivid. It was interesting. You probably saw quite recently, within the last few days, I think it was, they set up a guillotine outside Jeff Bezos' mansion, which I thought was kind of amusing, up to the point that it wasn't. and clearly, you know, people are seeing in the excesses that BLM has now gone to, that there is a sense of a Maoist cultural revolution. There is a whole bunch of playbook stuff from previous historical epochs going through. So this is where it really does pay to know these things in some detail, so that it becomes blindingly obvious to you when you literally see it starting to play out in front of you. Okay, we don't have to do this. We're on automatic pilot now. You know, this is the kind of stuff when Gurdjieff met Ouspensky against the backdrop of the collapse of Russia in the First World War and the Russian Revolution. You know, he really showed Ouspensky, because it was so vivid to him, the extent to which everybody's just sleepwalking. Everybody's just completely mechanical. And you just go from something that seems perfectly legitimate, it just runs away very, very quickly. And before you know where you are, where it started off from, it's been completely left behind. It's turned into something else altogether. And there's so much of this going down. So, yeah, read the history and be aware of the fact that however much these things run along and go into automatic pilot, no matter what's going on, we've always got free will, and we don't have to get sucked into it. You know, these are the times of discrimination when the real teachers of the mystery schools and so on, if they're worth anything at all, they're for times like these. And maybe this weird vibe of wandering bishops and strange things that connect us back down through the ages and connect us up to other people in other periods of time of upheaval and turmoil, back to, you know, the definitive times, really, the fall of the goddamn Roman Empire, man. You know, whenever you get to these big episodes, you get the vibe of all of that. And they've got something to teach us. You know, there are some wise people then. And they are, I think, communicating to us now in ways that, you know, depend on our temperament as to how we get them, whether we go all Stoic and Marcus Aurelius, or whether we go all Gnostic or a bit of each, whatever it is, you know, it's alive and with us, and we've got to find our centre of gravity in it.
Absolutely. And I just got to say, that is one of the things I really appreciate about your work so much. Speaking as a fellow history buff and a buff specifically of really obscure history, it's just remarkable how you're able to connect all of these things from our distant past to issues that are really still playing out to this day. Certainly I agree with you. We very much need to learn more from our past. For as the old saying goes, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. And hopefully we will not be repeating some of the past failures of this millennialism, as you've just alluded to, because it was not pretty, folks. And with that thought, we're going to be signing off for now. This is your host, Recluse. As always, folks, I want to thank you guys so much for listening, and thank you so much, Paul, for joining us again here on the farm. Stay tuned to next time, folks, and good night and good luck.